My client's cousin tried to blackmail me at his family reunion, hinting he'd seen me somewhere before, while smirking like he'd already won. When I told him I wouldn't lie to protect him, he grabbed my arm and said, "You ruined my entire life." I just stared at him. That was 9 months ago. Last week, he was let out of his office in handcuffs while his co-workers watched from the windows. A client begged me to be his fake girlfriend for an entire day. No intimacy, just pretend to be in love with him at his family reunion. Apparently, he'd been lying to his family for 6 months about dating someone named Jess, and his cousin Derek had been calling him out, demanding to meet this mysterious girlfriend. I figured I'd eat some free food, tell some made-up stories, and walk away with rent money. What could possibly go wrong? Well, turns out his cousin Derek was one of my regular clients. Anyway, he picked me up 5 hours before the reunion and ran me through who Jess was, the fake girlfriend he'd been playing up for 6 months. Jess and him met at a bookstore reaching for the same copy of Murakami's Norwegian Wood, allergic to shellfish but loved sushi, played volleyball in college, and always ordered her coffee with oat milk and 2 sugars. The way he'd built this entire person from scratch was actually impressive, but the panic in his eyes told me Derek had pushed him past his breaking point. When we arrived at his aunt's house early, I slipped into character immediately. His mom practically sprinted across the lawn to hug me, tears in her eyes, saying she'd been waiting months to meet the girl who made Dylan so happy. Within minutes, his uncle dragged us into the family cornhole tournament, insisting we play as a couple. Dylan was terrible, but every time he missed, I'd pat his back and call him baby, like we'd practiced, and his family ate it up. When I scored the winning point, Dylan lifted me up and spun me around while everyone cheered. His teenage cousin yelled, "Couple goals!" And honestly, we did look good together. About an hour in, Dylan pulled me aside by the drinks table and whispered, "You're incredible. You know every single thing. You're making me look like the luckiest guy here." The genuine gratitude in his voice caught me off guard. His grandmother cornered us to show me Dylan's baby photos, going on about how she'd never seen him smile this much, how I must be the one. Then she added, "Derek's almost here," she mentioned casually. Dylan's hand tightened in mine, but the sweetest moment came later when his 5-year-old niece tugged on my dress and asked if Dylan was my prince. Before I could answer, Dylan scooped her up and said, "Actually, Jess is my princess," and she saved me. The little girl made us do a fairy tale kiss, and when Dylan leaned in, he whispered, "You're amazing," against my lips. His whole family erupted in applause. His mom was sobbing, his dad was filming, and when we pulled apart, Dylan kept looking at me with this soft wonder. For a moment, I forgot about the money, forgot about the act, forgot I had a real name that wasn't Jess. Then Derek walked in. I saw him before he saw me, and my blood went cold. Derek was one of my Tuesday regulars, single, cocky, liked to book me for overnight sessions where I'd pretend to be whatever fantasy he had that week. He froze in the doorway, staring at me wrapped in Dylan's arms. The recognition hit his face like a slap. Then came that smile. Not angry, but absolutely delighted, like Christmas came early. Well, Derek said, strutting over. "You must be the famous Jess." He hugged me way too long, whispering, "This is fucking perfect." When he pulled back, he was practically glowing with excitement. Dylan didn't notice, just kept beaming, clapping Derek on the back, saying how he'd finally get to meet the woman he'd been talking about. Derek spent the rest of the afternoon orchestrating chaos. "Let's play couples trivia. Jess, what's Dylan's coffee order?" I panicked and said black while Dylan said oat milk latte at the same time. Derek howled with laughter. "6 months and she doesn't know your coffee? Dylan, what's Jess's middle name?" Dylan went white. "Show everyone your favorite photo together." Neither of us had any. Derek made us do a couples challenge where we had to answer questions back to back. "Where did you first say I love you?" We said completely different places. The whole family started looking confused while Derek kept pushing, but somehow we survived it. Dylan jumped in with save after save, making jokes about being bad with anniversaries and me being terrible with photos. By the time everyone left, we'd barely held it together. Dylan looked exhausted, defeated, his earlier joy completely drained. When he dropped me off, he kept apologizing for Derek being such an asshole and thanking me for pushing through. I didn't have the heart to tell him that Derek knew exactly who I was. The guy looked so crushed already. I figured that was the end of it. Then I woke up the next morning to 16 missed calls from Dylan, texts in all caps. "Need you now. Emergency. Please answer." I called him back immediately, and he answered before the first ring even finished. He was talking so fast I could barely understand him. Something about Derek and a family dinner and his mom crying, and I had to tell him to slow down and start from the beginning. 20 minutes later, he picked me up in his Tesla, his hands shaking as he explained that Derek had called his parents that morning, suggesting they throw a special dinner tomorrow night to celebrate me joining the family. His mom had already invited 30 people, including his grandmother, who was flying in from Houston, and Derek had specifically requested that I wear the same dress from the reunion so everyone could see how beautiful Dylan's girlfriend looked in photos. Dylan parked outside a Starbucks, and we went inside where he pulled out his phone to show me the family group chat that Derek had started, filled with excited messages about finally getting to know me better. Derek's message at the top said he wanted to make up for being difficult at the reunion by hosting the dinner at his house, even offering to cater it from that expensive steakhouse downtown. Then Dylan's phone rang, and when he saw it was Derek, his face went white, but he answered it on speaker anyway. Derek's voice came through smooth and friendly, asking if we'd gotten the dinner invitation and saying how his mom was already planning the seating arrangements to make sure we sat at the main table with the grandparents. He mentioned how excited everyone was to hear more about our love story, especially after some family members had questions about how well we really knew each other at the reunion. The threat was so obvious I felt sick, and when Derek added that he'd love to hear about where I worked and what I did for a living, Dylan's hand found mine under the table and squeezed hard. After Dylan hung up, he turned to me with this desperate look and said he'd pay me triple my usual rate if I'd help him figure out how to handle Derek without his family getting hurt. I realized right then that I wasn't just playing a fake girlfriend anymore. I was basically hired as damage control for whatever Derek was planning. We stayed at that Starbucks for 3 hours while Dylan showed me Derek's social media accounts on his laptop, scrolling through years of posts where Derek had systematically destroyed other family members while looking like the concerned cousin. There was his cousin Jennifer, whose OnlyFans account got exposed at Thanksgiving, his cousin Michael, whose DUI arrest somehow made it into the church newsletter, and his own sister Natalie, whose miscarriage became family gossip after Derek accidentally let it slip at Easter brunch. Dylan explained that Derek had been doing this for years, always maintaining plausible deniability while positioning himself as the responsible eldest grandson who just happened to be present when family scandals erupted. The worst part was learning that Derek had access to their grandmother's will revision meetings since he drove her to her lawyer appointments every month, and the inheritance was substantial enough that Derek had been systematically eliminating competition for years. Dylan showed me a spreadsheet he'd been keeping of every family member Derek had targeted, and the timeline always matched when those relatives had gotten close to their grandmother or achieved something significant. My phone buzzed, and when I saw it was my agency calling, my stomach dropped because they never called unless there was a serious problem. The woman on the other end said they'd received a concerning call about me potentially violating client confidentiality and discussing private session details with third parties, and while they couldn't reveal who made the complaint, they needed me to come in within 48 hours to discuss this serious allegation. Derek was already applying pressure but being careful not to leave evidence, and the agency woman's tone made it clear that my entire career was now at risk. I was still processing this when Sophia walked into the Starbucks like it was a total coincidence, though the way she headed straight for our booth made it obvious Derek had sent her. She slid in next to Dylan with her phone already out, live streaming to her 50,000 followers, and gushing about randomly running into her favorite cousin and his gorgeous girlfriend. We were trapped into performing for her audience while she asked increasingly specific questions about our relationship, her followers commenting in real time with hearts and questions about when we were getting engaged. Sophia kept pushing for details about how we met, where our first date was, what my favorite thing about Dylan was, and I watched her screenshot specific moments when our answers didn't quite match up. Dylan tried to deflect by talking about how bad he was with dates and details, but Sophia just laughed and said her followers loved getting to know authentic couples who weren't perfect. She stayed for an hour, her phone never leaving her hand, building a digital trail of inconsistencies that Derek could use whenever he wanted. After she finally left, Dylan showed me a text from his dad saying his mom was so happy that she was planning to announce our engagement at tomorrow's dinner, that she'd already told her friends at church and bought champagne for the toast. The pressure was mounting from every direction, and Derek was orchestrating it perfectly, using his family's excitement against us while keeping his own hands clean. Dylan created an entire person from scratch, allergic to shellfish but loves sushi, met at a bookstore over the same book. How did he remember all these tiny details about someone who doesn't even exist? That evening back at my apartment, I pulled out my laptop and went through 2 years of Derek's Tuesday night sessions, reading through my notes about his specific requests and preferences. He always wanted the same fantasy where he was a powerful executive married to a cold, career-focused wife, and I'd play the secretary who understood him better than anyone. But buried in those sessions were comments about Dylan, always with this bitter edge about how Dylan got everything handed to him, how Dylan was the grandmother's favorite despite doing nothing to deserve it. Then I found something interesting in my notes from 6 months ago, where Derek had mentioned Dylan getting a promotion at his tech company, and how unfair it was that Dylan succeeded without really trying. Around 11 that night, Dylan called me drunk and rambling, apologizing over and over for dragging me into his family drama, saying he should have just told the truth at the reunion instead of making everything worse. He kept saying Derek always won these games, that Derek had gotten their cousin Jennifer disowned by revealing her OnlyFans at Thanksgiving dinner in front of their whole religious family. Dylan told me about their cousin David, whose gambling problem became family knowledge right when he was about to propose to his girlfriend, and their Aunt Patricia, whose affair from 20 years ago suddenly surfaced at her daughter's wedding. I barely slept that night thinking about all the lives Derek had destroyed just for fun. The next morning, I grabbed my keys to head out for groceries and found Derek sitting in my apartment building's lobby scrolling through his phone. He stood up when he saw me and blocked the exit door with that same satisfied smile from yesterday. He suggested we should rehearse for tonight's dinner since we both wanted Dylan to be happy. His hand moved to his phone screen showing a review site where my profile was listed, and he reminded me that client confidentiality worked both ways. One bad review from a regular client would destroy everything I'd built over 3 years. He leaned closer and mentioned he'd already told his mother Elena that I looked really familiar from somewhere, but he couldn't quite place it. He'd planted just enough doubt to make her suspicious without actually accusing me of anything. My phone started buzzing with texts from Dylan, and Derek stepped aside to let me read them. Dylan was panicking because his mom had invited his ex-girlfriend Rachel to dinner tonight, thinking some competition might help me commit to him. Rachel had never gotten over their breakup 2 years ago and had been waiting for any chance to get him back. Derek watched me read the messages with obvious satisfaction, knowing he'd probably suggested Rachel's invitation himself. I pushed past him and drove straight to the dress shop Dylan's mom had recommended for tonight. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I sat in the parking lot, realizing Derek had trapped me completely. If I didn't show up tonight, Dylan's family would think I'd abandoned him, but if I did show up, Derek could expose me anytime he wanted. Inside the shop, I was looking at dresses when Linda walked in carrying a cake box. She saw me and practically ran over with tears in her eyes, pulling me into the tightest hug. She kept saying she was already thinking of me as a daughter, and showed me photos on her phone of an engagement announcement slideshow she'd been working on. The photos were from yesterday's reunion with captions like "Our future daughter" and "Dylan finally found his soulmate" under pictures of us laughing together. She mentioned the dinner tonight would be extra special and winked before leaving with her cake. Dylan picked me up at 6 and we drove to Elena's house in silence, both dreading what Derek had planned. When we pulled up to the house, my stomach dropped completely. White roses covered every surface and engagement banners hung across the front porch. Through the windows, I could see at least 40 people inside, including what looked looked like Dylan's boss and several family friends. Derek stood at the entrance holding champagne and grinning like he'd won the lottery. Dylan froze, completely unable to move from the car, so I grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the house. I whispered that we needed to act so in love that Derek wouldn't dare ruin such a beautiful moment in front of everyone. Derek intercepted us, immediately raising his glass and announcing loudly that he'd prepared a special toast for the happy couple. He started talking about knowing me in different contexts, and I watched Dylan's face go white. Before Derek could continue, Grace came running up in a pink dress and tugged on my skirt, demanding I come see the cake she'd helped decorate. She pulled me away from Derek toward the kitchen and whispered that Uncle Derek seemed really mean tonight. At the cake table, she showed me the flowers she'd placed while keeping her voice low, saying Derek had been saying weird things about me all day. Through the kitchen window, I saw a red sports car pull up, and Rachel stepped out in a stunning red dress that showed way too much leg. She walked straight to Dylan and air kissed him while loudly talking about their relationship before I came along. Derek moved across the room, positioning himself perfectly to watch both of us struggle with this new problem he'd created. Rachel walked straight up to me and grabbed my arm like we were old friends while telling everyone about the time Dylan and her went to Cabo together last year. Dylan's face went pale as his mom started asking questions about why he never mentioned staying friends with his ex. I watched Derek lean back in his chair with this satisfied smirk while Rachel kept going on about their romantic dinner at sunset and how Dylan always ordered the same wine. The whole family was eating this up and Dylan kept trying to interrupt, but Rachel just talked louder about how she was so happy he found someone new, even though they had such amazing chemistry. After 20 minutes of this torture, Dylan grabbed my hand and announced he wasn't feeling well and we needed to leave. His mom looked concerned, but Derek jumped in saying we should stay since Rachel drove all this way to see everyone. Dylan practically dragged me to his car while his family watched from the porch looking confused about the whole situation. The second we got in the car, I told him everything that Sophia had said about Derek's business failing and the $300,000 he owed and how he was planning to get me fired from my agency. Dylan gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white, and then he told me something that made my stomach drop. Derek had power of attorney for their grandmother, who had dementia and controlled all her finances. He'd gotten it 2 years ago when she first got diagnosed, and nobody questioned it because he was always her favorite grandson. Dylan said their grandfather left everything in a trust that the grandmother controlled, and Derek had been managing it for the past year. The next morning, I woke up to Dylan calling me in a panic because his mom was crying on the phone. Someone had sent an anonymous email to her entire church group with concerns about the new girlfriend Dylan was dating. It wasn't my escort profile, but carefully written hints about a woman who might not have Dylan's best interests at heart. The email talked about how some women target successful families and mentioned seeing suspicious behavior at family gatherings. Linda was devastated and confused about who would send something like this and why anyone would want to hurt Dylan. We drove straight to Robert's office that morning, and Dylan's dad was already there waiting with a stack of papers. Robert admitted he'd been suspicious of Derek for months after noticing strange withdrawals from the grandmother's accounts. He showed us bank statements with $50,000 here and $70,000 there, all matching up with when Derek's restaurant business started failing. The problem was they needed proof Derek was doing this without the grandmother's consent, since he technically had legal authority. Dylan suddenly broke down right there in his dad's office and told him everything about hiring me to be his fake girlfriend. His voice cracked as he explained how Derek had been tormenting him for months about not having anyone and how desperate he felt. Robert wasn't even surprised and said he knew something was off at the reunion, but wanted Dylan to handle it himself. He put his hand on Dylan's shoulder and said they were going to expose Derek legally and protect the family's assets. That's when I remembered something Derek had said during one of our Tuesday sessions about his grandmother. He'd mentioned how she doesn't remember anything anyway, and how he used to be her favorite until the dementia hit. I recorded all my sessions for safety and had everything backed up on external drives at my apartment. I told Robert about the recordings and his eyes lit up because this could be the evidence they needed. When I got back to my apartment that afternoon, my door was slightly open, even though I always triple-check the locks. Someone had searched the place professionally without destroying anything, but clearly going through everything. My backup drives with all the client recordings were gone from my desk drawer and my hidden safe. Derek was escalating way beyond just threats now and knew exactly what he was looking for. My phone rang and it was Sophia crying so hard she could barely talk. Derek had found out about her OnlyFans account and threatened to send the link to their parents unless she helped him destroy me. She was terrified but willing to testify about his threats if we could protect her from their family finding out. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown the next day where there would be witnesses around. How did Derek know exactly where to find those backup drives? The way he searched without destroying anything shows he knew what he was looking for and where it might be hidden. Dylan called that night with more bad news because Derek had scheduled a family meeting for tomorrow. The agenda was to discuss concerns about Dylan's judgment and whether he was ready for his inheritance responsibilities. Derek was moving fast to discredit Dylan before the will reading next month. I sat in my ransacked apartment staring at my laptop and remembering I had cloud backups Derek didn't know about. The thing was accessing them meant admitting I recorded clients without explicit consent, which could cost me my license. I sat there for an hour trying to decide if protecting Dylan was worth potentially destroying my entire career. Then Robert called with urgent news that made everything else seem less important. The grandmother's nurse had noticed Derek visiting at weird hours when the grandmother was heavily medicated. The nursing home had security footage showing Derek with documents during times when the grandmother couldn't possibly consent to anything. Robert said this was the pattern of elder abuse evidence they needed to take to the authorities. The next morning, Linda called an emergency family meeting at her house and told everyone to come immediately. When I walked in with Dylan, I saw a woman I'd never met sitting next to Derek on the couch. Derek had this smug look on his face like he'd already won something. The woman stood up and said she was Rachel and she'd seen me on some escort website months ago. She started listing off dates when Dylan supposedly hired me but got them all wrong. She said we met in January when Dylan had told everyone we met in March. Linda's eyes narrowed as Rachel kept talking because the dates made no sense at all. Rachel claimed Dylan paid me $3,000 for a weekend in Dallas when the whole family knew Dylan was at his cousin's wedding that weekend. Even Elena looked confused as Rachel kept messing up basic facts about when things happened. Dylan suddenly stood up and his voice was shaking but loud. He started listing every single time Derek had destroyed someone in the family. Jennifer's OnlyFans pictures that Derek accidentally found and shared at Thanksgiving dinner. Their cousin Tom's divorce after Derek told Tom's wife about an old affair at a barbecue. Derek always made himself look like the good one while ruining everyone else's lives. The whole room went silent as Dylan kept going, years of anger finally coming out. Elena stood up next and pulled out a folder from her purse. She said Derek's ex-fiancée was her goddaughter, and she'd been keeping track of Derek's lies for months. She spread bank statements across the coffee table showing $50,000 missing from the wedding fund. The money was supposed to pay for venues and caterers, but Derek had taken it all. Derek's face went red and he started yelling that he needed that money to pay off the ex-fiancée's brother. Everyone froze when they realized what he'd just admitted. Robert had his phone out recording everything for the lawyers. Grace walked over from where she'd been coloring in the corner and tugged on Elena's sleeve. She said Uncle Derek was mean and told her not to tell anyone he visited great-grandma last week. Even the 5-year-old had seen him sneaking around when the grandmother was sleeping. The next morning, Robert went to the police station and filed a formal complaint about elder financial abuse. The detective said they'd need to evaluate the grandmother's mental state and get all the bank records. It would take several weeks, but Derek's accounts were frozen immediately while they investigated. Dylan and I sat in a coffee shop afterward, both completely exhausted from everything. He kept apologizing for dragging me into this mess and offered to pay me extra for all the trauma. I realized sitting there that I didn't want his money anymore. I wanted Derek to pay for what he'd done to this family. My phone rang and it was my agency saying Derek had filed a complaint about me breaking confidentiality rules. Since he'd admitted to crimes though, they weren't going to do anything about it. They suggested I take a break until the legal stuff was sorted out. Linda texted asking if I could meet her alone at a park near her house. When I got there, she handed me a small velvet box with an old silver bracelet inside. She said she knew I wasn't really dating Dylan, but she didn't care about any of that. I'd helped her son finally stand up to Derek, and that was worth more than anything. She fastened the bracelet on my wrist and said I'd earned a place in their family. That night, I was walking through my apartment building's garage when Derek appeared from behind a pillar. He was drunk and desperate, waving a bag with $30,000 in cash. He begged me to disappear and tell the police I'd made everything up about him. When I said no and tried to walk past him, he grabbed my arm hard. His fingers dug in deep enough to leave marks, and he said I'd ruined his entire life. The garage lights suddenly got brighter as 2 security guards ran toward us yelling for Derek to let go. He shoved me hard into my car before taking off, but they caught him at the exit while I stood there shaking. The older guard helped me up and said they'd been watching Derek on cameras for 3 days straight, trying to get into cars and waiting by the entrance. They showed me footage on their phone of him using a crowbar on my car door the night before. The younger guard called the cops while the older one brought me water and kept saying they had everything recorded. Within an hour, I was at the police station filing a restraining order with my arm already turning purple from Derek's grip. The detective took photos of the bruises and said this, plus the garage footage would make the order stick immediately. Day 6 came fast, and Sophia texted me to meet her at the main police station downtown. She walked in carrying 2 shopping bags full of papers, bank statements, and printed texts from Derek. She spread everything across the detective's desk, showing how Derek took cash advances on 3 of her credit cards. He'd promised to pay her back once he got his grandmother's inheritance money that he said was coming any day. The detective's eyes went wide, looking at $40,000 in charges over just 2 months. Sophia had screenshots of Derek bragging about controlling the family money and how nobody would question him. Then the detective dropped his own bomb on us. 3 other escorts had come forward after seeing the news about Derek's arrest. One woman had recordings on her phone of Derek saying he owned the family trust and could do whatever he wanted. Another showed texts where Derek threatened to out her to her family if she didn't give him free sessions. The third had filed a police report months ago that went nowhere until now. The detective said Derek had been doing this for at least 2 years based on what they'd found so far. My phone rang that afternoon and Dylan was crying on the other end. His grandmother had woken up clear-headed for the first time in weeks and remembered everything about Derek's visits. She told the nurse that Derek brought papers when she was drowsy from her pain medication and guided her hand to sign. She thought she was signing birthday cards, but now realized it was probably bank documents. Dylan said she kept apologizing and asking if everyone was okay, breaking his heart completely. The worst part was going back to work the next week with a different agency across town. Every new client made my skin crawl even though I'd never had problems before in 3 years. I kept checking exits, recording license plates, and jumping when anyone moved too fast near me. One regular client noticed my hands shaking and asked if I was okay, but I couldn't explain. Derek had taken something from me that I couldn't get back, my sense of safety in my own job. Day 8. I was buying groceries when someone tapped my shoulder and I almost screamed. Rachel stood there looking terrified, glancing around like someone was watching us. She shoved a note in my hand and whispered that Derek made her come. The note said if I testified, he'd post fake porn he'd made with my escort photos on every site he could find. Rachel grabbed my arm and said Derek wasn't joking, that she'd seen the files on his computer before she left him. She looked genuinely scared, not like she was helping him, but like she was another victim now too. That night, Dylan called to say his dad hired some computer expert to look into Derek's online stuff. The guy found Derek had been making fake profiles with my photos for weeks, setting up accounts on dating sites and escort boards. But Derek was stupid because everything traced back to his home IP address and personal devices. The expert had screenshots of Derek logged into these fake accounts from his own laptop. Dylan said they'd turned everything over to the prosecutor, who was adding cyber crimes to the charges. 2 days later, Elena called a family meeting at her house but told everyone Derek wasn't invited. When I walked in with Dylan, nobody looked surprised to see me anymore. Elena stood up and announced she was formally disowning Derek and had been helping the police for weeks. She pulled out a box of her mother's jewelry that Derek claimed got lost in a move last year. She'd found the pawn shop receipts in his old room showing he'd sold everything for cash. Elena said she was done protecting him and wanted everyone to know she stood with the victims. Grace ran up to me during the meeting with a piece of paper covered in crayon. She'd drawn me as a superhero with a cape fighting a monster that had Derek's weird goatee. Dylan picked it up and told everyone I really was their hero for exposing who Derek really was. He went to his car and came back with a frame, putting Grace's drawing inside and saying he was keeping it forever. Elena hugged me and whispered that I'd saved their family from Derek's poison even if it didn't feel that way. The security guards had been watching Derek for 3 whole days. That's such smart thinking to keep cameras on him after seeing him act suspicious. I wonder if they have special training to spot people who might cause trouble in parking garages like. The prosecutor called the next morning with shocking news about Derek's ex-fiance's brother showing up at the station. He'd been arrested for beating up his dealer but wanted to make a deal about Derek's bigger crimes. He had texts proving Derek borrowed money from dangerous people using his grandmother's house as collateral. The brother said Derek promised to pay everyone back once he got full control of the inheritance money. He even had a recording of Derek explaining how he was moving money from his grandmother's accounts to cover gambling debts. The prosecutor said this was the final piece to show Derek's pattern of financial abuse and fraud spanning years. 3 days later, Dylan called me at 7 in the morning to say they were arresting Derek at his office. I threw on clothes and met him outside Derek's building downtown where cops were already setting up. Dylan looked tired and kept checking his phone every few seconds. We waited in his car watching the entrance while more police arrived. Around 9:30 they went in and Dylan gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. 20 minutes later, Derek came out in handcuffs between 2 officers. His co-workers pressed against the windows watching him get walked to the police car. Derek saw Dylan standing by his car and their eyes met for a second. Dylan started to raise his hand like he wanted to wave but dropped it and just stood there looking sad. Derek got pushed into the back seat and they drove away while everyone in the office kept staring. That night, the local news ran the story about the arrest with Derek's work photo on screen. The headline said, "Prominent Austin family torn apart by elder abuse scandal," and showed footage of his office building. They listed all the charges, including fraud and extortion, but kept my name out of it completely. Derek's company sent out a press release saying he was suspended immediately pending investigation. His LinkedIn disappeared within hours, and people started sharing the news story on Facebook. The next morning, Rachel showed up at Dylan's apartment while I was there making coffee. She looked rough with dark circles under her eyes and kept wringing her hands. She told Dylan that Derek had paid her $5,000 to lie about seeing me with other men. She'd lost her job 3 months ago and was about to lose her apartment when Derek contacted her. Dylan just sat there listening while she cried and apologized over and over. She said she'd already told the prosecutor everything and would testify against Derek at trial. After she left, Dylan held me for a long time without saying anything. That night, I woke up screaming from a nightmare about being on the witness stand. In the dream, the whole courtroom knew I was an escort and everyone was laughing at me. My client list got read out loud and all my regulars were sitting in the gallery shaking their heads. I couldn't sleep after that and spent the rest of the night Googling what happens to escorts who testify in court. My therapist said it was PTSD from all the stalking and threats Derek had put me through. She prescribed me something for the anxiety, but I was still having the dreams every night. 2 days later, Robert called us over to discuss the estate audit results. The forensic accountants had found over $200,000 Derek stole over 2 years. He'd been moving money from his grandmother's accounts into shell companies he controlled. The family decided to use part of the recovered money for better security at the nursing home. They also hired a full-time aide just for the grandmother to make sure she was never alone. Robert said the rest would go into a trust that Derek couldn't touch even if he got out. Dylan took me to lunch the next day at this quiet place near campus. He said he'd been thinking about the trial and decided to tell the truth about hiring me. He didn't care what his family thought anymore because Derek's lies had shown him how toxic secrets were. He kept saying Derek getting exposed taught him that living honestly was better than keeping up fake stories. I tried to tell him he didn't have to do that, but he'd already made up his mind. That afternoon, Derek's lawyer called my phone while I was grocery shopping. He said if I refused to testify, Derek would lead to lesser charges and only get probation. When I said no, he got nasty and said my entire client list could get subpoenaed in discovery. He mentioned specific names of men I'd seen and said they'd all have to testify too. I hung up on him, but my hands were shaking so bad I dropped my groceries in the parking lot. Sophia posted on Facebook the next day about starting a GoFundMe for Derek's victims. She wrote this long post about how Derek had manipulated her for years and stolen money from her too. Within hours, other escorts started sharing it and telling their own stories about abusive clients. The fundraiser hit $10,000 in the first day, and Sophia said she wanted to use it for legal protection for sex workers. Comments poured in from women I knew in the business sharing screenshots of threats from their own Dereks. It became this whole movement about protecting escorts from dangerous clients who thought they owned us. Linda invited me to a family barbecue that weekend, and I almost didn't go. When we got there, she stood up in front of everyone and made this speech. She said however Dylan and I met, I'd saved their family from a predator who'd been stealing from them. The whole family started clapping, and Elena came over to hug me with tears in her eyes. Grace ran up and asked if I was going to marry Uncle Dylan now that the bad man was gone. Even Robert shook my hand and thanked me for having the courage to stand up to Derek. 2 weeks after the arrest, I started seeing clients again, but everything felt different. Some of them had heard rumors and asked careful questions about what happened. I was pickier now about who I'd see, and immediately blocked anyone who seemed controlling. One regular said he'd seen the news about Derek and asked if I knew him. I just changed the subject, but he could tell something was off. Derek had changed how I worked forever, and made me realize how vulnerable I'd always been. I started requiring references and deposits and stopped doing overnight night sessions completely. The other girls in my circle said I seemed harder now, but also stronger somehow. Dylan started texting me updates about his therapy sessions every week, not as a client anymore, but as someone who actually gave a damn about his progress. He'd send photos of his therapy homework where he had to write about why he lied to his family for 6 months. The therapist made him trace it back to childhood stuff with his dad, always comparing him to Derek. I'd read his messages while getting ready for work, and sometimes text back little encouragement things. Our whole relationship had shifted into something I couldn't quite name, but it felt real in a way nothing else in my life did. Then the prosecutor called with news that made my stomach drop. Derek's lawyer had filed a motion saying Derek had recordings of our sessions together. My hands went numb holding the phone. The prosecutor said they were illegally recorded and couldn't be used in court, but Derek's lawyer was trying to argue they showed a pattern of something. The judge shut it down fast, but just knowing those recordings existed made me want to throw up. I kept thinking about all the things Derek had made me say during our Tuesday nights. The prosecutor assured me the recordings were sealed, but the damage was already done in my head. That Sunday, Linda invited me to family dinner again, and I almost said no, but Dylan begged me to come for Grace's sake. When I walked in, Grace ran straight to me asking if I was still Uncle Dylan's princess. I knelt down and told her I was his friend who helped fight the dragon. She thought about it for a second, then asked if that meant the fairy tale was different now. I said sometimes the best stories don't end with marriage but with friendship. She seemed satisfied with that and dragged me to see her new dollhouse. The prosecutor called again on day 20 with updates about Derek's plea deal. They were offering him 5 years for what he did to his grandma and 2 years for the extortion stuff to run at the same time. If he went to trial and lost, he'd face 15 years minimum. His lawyer was pushing him hard to take it, but Derek was being Derek. 3 days later, we got word that Derek turned down the plea. The prosecutor wasn't surprised and said Derek thought he could charm a jury the same way he'd always charmed his family. Trial was set for next month. His delusions about his own powers of persuasion were still completely intact despite sitting in jail. Dylan asked me to help him write his victim impact statement for the trial. We sat in his apartment for hours while he struggled to find words for what Derek had done to his sense of self. He'd write a sentence, then cross it out, then stare at the paper. I helped him organize his thoughts into something the court could understand. He talked about growing up always feeling less than Derek and how that made him create fake Jess. We worked through how Derek's manipulation went back decades. More escorts started coming forward with Derek's stories once word got out about the case. The prosecutor said they had 5 other women now with similar experiences. What started as family drama had exploded into a major criminal case. Derek had been doing this for years apparently. Then everything went to hell when Derek tried to kill himself in jail. The call came at 3 in the morning from Elena sobbing that Derek had used his bedsheet. He left a note blaming everyone but himself for ruining his life. The guards found him in time and he survived, but they put him on psychiatric hold. Even after everything he'd done, the family was shaken because they didn't want him dead. Derek's brother showing up with recordings of Derek explaining his money schemes? That's such a strange twist. Why would Derek trust him with those details when he was so careful about everything else? Elena completely broke down at the hospital. She sat in the waiting room confessing to anyone who'd listen that she'd enabled Derek his whole life. She'd paid his rent when he was between jobs and believed every lie he told about needing money for emergencies. The family finally had to confront how they'd all contributed to creating the monster Derek became. Linda admitted she'd always made excuses for him because Elena was her sister. Robert said he'd ignored red flags for years to keep family peace. Everyone had played a part in letting Derek become who he was. After Derek got out of psychiatric hold, his lawyer convinced him to take a modified plea deal. 8 years with mandatory therapy was better than risking 15 at trial. In court, Derek finally admitted to the elder abuse and extortion charges. His apology sounded hollow and rehearsed, but the judge accepted the plea. She noted the severity of stealing from an elderly woman with dementia and said the 8 years reflected that seriousness. Dylan stood up to read his victim impact statement and the whole courtroom went quiet. His hands shook holding the paper, but his voice stayed steady as he described how Derek used their grandmother's love as a weapon. He talked about the fake girlfriend scheme being just the start of Derek's manipulation. He explained how Derek turned family trust into control and weaponized every holiday gathering. Dylan said he forgave Derek, but boundaries would stay permanent. The judge nodded and thanked him for his courage. When my turn came to testify, I kept it simple and focused on the extortion attempts without naming any clients. The prosecutor had coached me on what to say to protect my privacy while still helping the case. The judge acknowledged my cooperation and said the court appreciated citizens coming forward despite personal risk. Outside the courthouse, the whole family gathered on the steps. Linda hugged me tight and thanked me again for everything. Robert shook my hand with real respect this time, not the fake politeness from before. Grace ran up with another drawing she'd made during the hearing. This one showed everyone smiling with hearts floating around. Elena stood apart from the group, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen her. 1 week later, Derek got transferred to state prison upstate. Elena went to see him once to say goodbye and tell him she'd help his kids, but not him. Robert set up a trust fund for Derek's children that Derek couldn't touch. The family restructured all the money with new safeguards Robert put in place. Dylan texted me asking to meet for coffee as friends. We met at a small place downtown where nobody knew us. He was dating a teacher now who he'd met at group therapy. He thanked me for helping him find the courage to tell the truth. He said our fake relationship taught him what real connection should feel like. I went back to escorting, but with new rules and better screening. Derek's games taught me to spot predatory clients from miles away. I was stronger now, but also more careful about boundaries. Sophia's GoFundMe for sex worker legal protection hit $50,000 in donations. She started speaking at conferences about safety and became a real advocate. Derek's actions accidentally created something good by bringing attention to the issue. The grandmother had a clear day and changed her will with Robert's help. She set up protections so nobody could exploit vulnerable family members again. Derek's children would get their share through the trust when they turned 25. 6 months passed and I got a wedding invitation from Dylan. He was married marrying the teacher and included a note thanking me for teaching him that messy truth beats perfect lies. The wedding was small and beautiful at a garden venue. I went as myself, using my real name for the first time with this family. Linda hugged me at the reception and whispered that I'd always be family to them. Dylan danced with his new bride, and they looked genuinely happy together. I realized we'd both escaped Derek's web by choosing to be real instead of fake. Grace caught the bouquet and ran straight to me to show it off. She called me by my real name, the first time anyone in the family had used it. Looking around at these people who'd become strangely important to me, I understood that sometimes the worst situations create the most unexpected connections. Derek was serving his 8 years while the rest of us were finally free to live honest lives. Man, this was such a fun one to dig into with you. I love going down these little rabbit holes together. Can't wait to do it again soon. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.